All right, let's go. Number 12. The softened stones of Sacsayhuaman. High above Cusco, Peru, a fortress sits on a ridge that should not exist. Sacsayhuaman is built from polygonal stones, some weighing up to 200 tons, fitted together so precisely that a razor blade cannot slide between them. Not in one place, not in the easy seams, anywhere. The walls run for hundreds of feet, and the joints stay impossibly tight along every inch. The official story is that the Inca built this fortress without iron tools, without mortar, without writing, without the wheel. They supposedly dragged 200-ton blocks up a mountainside, shaped each one into a stone with 12 or more irregular angles, and locked them into a wall that has survived earthquakes that flattened the Spanish cathedrals built downhill. There is no written record of how it was done. No instruction tablet, no quarry diagram, nothing. Here's where the mainstream account begins to fracture. Each stone at Sacsayhuaman is unique. Not standardized blocks cut to a template, but jigsaw pieces, each one carved to match its neighbor's contours exactly. 12 angles, 16 angles, concave faces meeting convex faces with hairline precision. Modern engineers, with laser scanners and diamond saws and hydraulic lifts, still cannot replicate the fit. They have tried. The seams always fail. This is where the suppressed theory begins. In the mid-20th century, a Peruvian priest named Father Jorge A. Lira reportedly spent years studying highland plants used in ancient Andean ritual. He claimed to have isolated a plant-based liquid that could soften stone, reducing granite and andesite to something like clay for a brief window before it hardened again. He said he replicated the process. The work was dismissed, the samples lost, the priest forgotten outside fringe circles. Stand at Sacsayhuaman at sunset, and the walls glow honey gold, and you notice something the textbooks do not explain. Some of the stones have rounded, almost melted edges. They look poured. They look as if they were pressed into place, while soft, then allowed to set against the neighboring block. The bulges of one stone match the depressions of the next, not as if they were carved to fit, but as if they cooled into each other. The orthodox archaeologist will tell you this is pareidolia. Stone is stone. The Inca were master masons, nothing more. But the Inca themselves left no record claiming credit. Their oral histories say the fortress was already old, built by an earlier people, in an earlier age, by methods their ancestors had forgotten. Modern engineers cannot reproduce the fit. The builders left no instructions. The priest who claimed to have found the answer was buried by his own academy. Somewhere in the highlands, a 200-ton stone is still locked against its neighbor, and nobody alive can tell you how it got there. Number 11. The Dogon and the Invisible Star. In the 1930s, French anthropologist Marcel Griaule traveled to Mali to study the Dogon, an isolated tribal people living along the cliffs of the Bandiagara escarpment. He documented their religious cosmology in painstaking detail, transcribing their oral traditions, their rituals, their sand drawings traced in the dust by elders who had never seen a telescope. What he recorded should not have existed. The Dogon told Griaule about Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky. They knew it was not alone. They described a second star orbiting Sirius, an invisible companion they called Potolo. They said Potolo was extraordinarily heavy, extraordinarily small, and extraordinarily dense. They said it traveled around Sirius in an elliptical path that took approximately 50 years to complete. They drew this orbit in the sand for him, sketching the long, oval trajectory with the precision of a textbook diagram. Western astronomers had confirmed the existence of Sirius B by telescope in 1862. They had only managed to photograph it in 1970. Between those two dates, the star existed in scientific literature as a faint, technical footnote, accessible to professional astronomers and almost no one else. It was not in popular books. It was not in school curricula. It was certainly not in the cultural circulation of rural Mali. Yet here was Griol in the 1930s, watching tribal elders draw the orbital geometry of a star that almost no one on Earth could see, and almost no one outside specialized observatories had ever heard of. The Dogon had an explanation. They said the knowledge had been given to them long ago by the Nomo, amphibious beings who descended from the sky. The Nomo, they said, came from the system of Sirius itself. They came to teach. They came to instruct the ancestors in matters the ancestors could not have learned by looking up at the night sky with the naked eye. To the Dogon, this was not mythology. It was history. Modern skeptics have spent decades trying to dismantle the story. They argue that Griol may have inadvertently fed the Dogon their own answers, or that European visitors in the early 20th century contaminated the cosmology with outside astronomy. These rebuttals are reasonable. They are also incomplete. The sand drawings, the elliptical paths, the density of Potolo, the 50-year orbital period, all of it sits in Griol's field notes, recorded before the photograph of Sirius B existed, recorded before the average European could have told you what a white dwarf star was. Here is where the dread sharpens. Stones can be carried. Pyramids can be built by hands we underestimate. But information, specific, technical, astronomically accurate information about an invisible companion star cannot be quarried out of a hillside. It has to come from somewhere. Either the Dogon were taught by someone who already knew, or human history contains a channel of knowledge that runs underneath the official record, quiet and unbroken, carrying answers to questions the rest of us hadn't learned to ask yet. And the Dogon are not the only ones who seem to have known too much, too early. Number 10. The Piri Reis Map. In 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis drew a map on gazelle's skin in ink. He decorated it with sea monsters, ships, and detailed harbors. The kind of flourishes you'd expect from any cartographer of his century. In his own notes, he claimed the map was compiled from older sources, some reportedly dating back to the era of Alexander the Great. For 4 centuries, this was a curiosity, an impressive piece of Ottoman cartography, nothing more. Then someone looked closely at the southern edge. The map shows a coastline that shouldn't be there. A long, detailed shore extending south of South America, curving in a way that matches no landmass known to the geographers of 1513. The continent it appears to depict is Antarctica, and Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820, more than 300 years after Piri Reis put ink to skin. That alone is strange. What comes next is worse. The coastline on the map does not show Antarctica as we know it today, buried under nearly 2 miles of ice. It shows the bare rock underneath, the land beneath the glaciers, the subglacial topography. In 1960, cartographers working for the United States Air Force examined the map against modern seismic surveys of the Antarctic bedrock. They endorsed the match. Their conclusion, recorded in official correspondence, was that the map depicted the continent's coastline as it would appear with the ice removed, with a level of accuracy they could not explain. Consider what that requires. To map a coastline buried under ice, you would need to have seen that coastline. You would need source material drawn from a time when Antarctica was not yet frozen. Geologists estimate the continent's last meaningful ice-free period was potentially 6,000 years ago or earlier. Some estimates push it considerably further back. Either way, the timeline collapses. The sources Piri Reis claimed to be working from would have to predate every civilization we currently credit with mapmaking. They would have to predate writing itself. Here's where the implications turn cold. Piri Reis was not a mystic. He was a working admiral with access to the Imperial Library in Constantinople, one of the largest collections of ancient documents in the world at that time. He said he used 20 source maps. He named some of them. Most of those sources are now lost, destroyed in the centuries of fire and conquest that followed. Whatever knowledge they contained passed through his hand once, in 1513, and then vanished. You are looking at a fingerprint. Someone, somewhere in deep prehistory, stood on a shore that has been frozen solid for thousands of years and recorded its shape accurately enough that 20th century military cartographers could verify the match. That knowledge survived long enough to reach an Ottoman library. It was copied onto gazelle skin, and then the chain broke. The official position is that the resemblance is coincidence, that the southern coastline is a distorted rendering of South America folded sideways to fit the parchment. The Air Force letter says otherwise. The bedrock says otherwise. Somewhere in the gap between those two answers sits a cartographer who knew something he was not supposed to know, working from sources that should not have existed. Number 9. The Baghdad Battery. In 1936, workers near Baghdad unearthed a cluster of small clay jars that should not have existed. They were dated to roughly 2,000 years ago, terracotta vessels barely 5 inches tall, the kind of thing you would expect to hold oil or seeds or a household ration of grain. But these jars were not empty in the way storage vessels are empty. Inside each one sat a copper cylinder. Inside each copper cylinder sat an iron rod. The tops were sealed with asphalt, a deliberate, patient sealant designed to hold something in place for a very long time. The copper had corroded to that distinctive green-blue patina that only forms when metal has been in sustained contact with an acidic electrolyte. That is not a storage vessel. That is a battery. Researchers who reconstructed the design discovered something deeply uncomfortable. Fill the jar with vinegar or grape juice, both readily available in the ancient Near East, and the assembly produces roughly 1.1 volts of electricity. Not a theoretical trickle, a measurable, repeatable, functional current. One jar is curious. A cluster of jars wired in series becomes a power source, and some researchers have proposed a specific use, electroplating, the deposition of a thin layer of gold onto silver objects using an electric current passed through a chemical bath. An ancient jeweler's trick, 2,000 years before we believed anyone understood the principle. Mainstream archaeology has a tidy answer. The jars are storage vessels. The copper held scrolls. The iron stabilized the assembly. The asphalt sealed it against moisture. A reasonable, deflationary explanation that resolves the artifact into something ordinary. But no scrolls were ever found inside. Not fragments. Not residue. Not the chemical ghost of papyrus or parchment in any of the recovered jars. The storage hypothesis explains everything except the contents that should have been there and weren't. Here's what that absence implies. Somewhere in Mesopotamia, 2,000 years ago, someone arranged copper around iron, sealed it with asphalt, filled it with a mild acid, and generated electricity. They did this deliberately enough to leave behind multiple examples. They did not write down what they were doing, or if they did, the records have not survived. The knowledge existed, was used, and then vanished, leaving only the hardware behind. Think about what that means for the timeline you were taught. Electricity was discovered in the 18th century. Volta built his pile in 1800. Every textbook treats the harnessing of current as a modern achievement, a triumph of Enlightenment science emerging from centuries of darkness. The Baghdad jars suggest the darkness was not as dark as we assumed. Knowledge does not only accumulate, it evaporates. It is forgotten. It is buried under empires and rediscovered by accident. And if a craftsman in ancient Iraq understood enough about chemistry and conductivity to generate current in a sealed clay jar, the question is no longer what they knew. The question is what else they knew that we have not yet found in the ground. Number 8. The Yonaguni Monument. In 1986, a Japanese dive instructor scouting hammerhead migration routes off the Ryukyu Islands descended into the Pacific and found something that shouldn't have been there. 80 feet beneath the surface, rising out of the seafloor, stood a structure of sharp right angles and broad flat terraces. Stone cut into geometry that the ocean does not produce on its own. The site sits off the coast of Yonaguni, the westernmost inhabited island of Japan. From the surface, there is nothing to see. The water is deep, the current is hard, and the visibility shifts with every tide. But below, the structure unfolds like a sunken citadel. Massive sandstone steps, draped in blue-green algae, descend in deliberate tiers. Edges meet at corners too clean to be coincidence. There are channels, platforms, what looks like a roadway, and on one face, what appears to be a carved face, eyes, and mouth roughed into the stone. Schools of hammerhead sharks circle the structure in slow, patient orbits. Divers describe the silence as physical, a pressure that closes around the ears as the geometry comes into focus through the murk. The terraces are wide enough to walk on. The angles are square enough to measure. The scale is wrong for anything natural, and wrong for anything that should exist where it exists, because this is the part that breaks the timeline. Yonaguni sits on a shelf that was above water during the last ice age. To stand on those terraces in open air, to cut those steps in daylight, the sea level had to be roughly 100 feet lower than it is today. That places the construction window more than 10,000 years ago, possibly considerably more. 10,000 years ago, the official record says Japan was inhabited by the Jomon, a culture of hunter-gatherers who lived in pit dwellings, made cord-marked pottery, and left no monumental architecture anywhere on the islands. No quarries, no cut stone, no engineering tradition, nothing in the archaeological record that would explain a terraced megastructure rising out of the seafloor off their coast. If Yonaguni is man-made, it predates every known Japanese civilization by millennia. It predates Göbekli Tepe. It predates writing, agriculture, the wheel. It predates the entire framework we use to talk about when civilization began. And then the sea rose, and whatever it was, whoever built it, drowned beneath 200,000 years of accumulating tide. Mainstream geologists insist the monument is natural, a freak of sandstone fracturing along bedding planes. The fractures, they argue, can produce right angles. The terraces, they say, are the result of differential erosion. The face is pareidolia, a trick of the human brain projecting meaning onto stone. But the divers keep going down. The right angles keep holding their shape. The carved face keeps staring out of the rock at the hammerheads circling above it. And somewhere on that submerged shelf, 10,000 years deep, is either the most convincing geological accident on Earth or the corner of a civilization the textbooks have no name for. You can swim through it. You can touch the steps. You cannot explain what you are touching. Number 7. Puma Punku's impossible stonework. High in the Bolivian Andes, at 12,800 feet of thin, lung-burning air, lies a ruin that engineers still cannot explain. Puma Punku sits on a windswept plateau where almost nothing grows, where the sky presses down and the cold cuts through cloth. The site is officially dated to around 500 CE, attributed to the Tiwanaku culture, a pre-Incan civilization that left no writing, no metal tools, no record of how it built what it built, and what it built should not exist. Scattered across the plateau are blocks of andesite and diorite, two of the hardest stones in the natural world. They lie in shattered arrangements, as if something enormous reached down and broke the structure apart. But the individual stones are perfect. Their surfaces are flat to millimeter precision, flatter than the floor you are standing on right now. Run your hand across one and you feel almost nothing. No chisel marks, no abrasion, no irregularity. They look machined. The joints are stranger still. Many blocks feature H-shaped interlocking cuts, mirrored faces that fit into each other with industrial exactness. These are not decorative. They are engineered, designed so that adjacent stones lock together along multiple axes, the kind of joint a modern fabricator would cut with a computer-controlled mill. Some of the drill holes bored into the stone are so uniform, so consistent in diameter and depth, that researchers have compared them to holes made with diamond-tipped bits. The spacing is regular. The walls of each hole are smooth. They march across the stone in straight lines, identical, repeating, machined. Then there is the weight. Some of these stones weigh over 100 tons. Not 10 tons. Not 50. Over 100. And they were not quarried on site. They were transported from quarries more than 10 miles away, across rugged Andean terrain, uphill, at altitudes that leave modern visitors gasping after a flight of stairs. No wheels. No draft animals capable of pulling that mass. No rivers running in the right direction. The official explanation is ropes, ramps, and manpower. Try to visualize it. Try to picture hundreds of people, lungs straining in the thin air, dragging a single 100-ton block across 10 miles of mountain. Now, consider the tools. Diorite ranks 7 to 8 on the Mohs hardness scale. To cut it cleanly, to drill it, to polish it to that mirror-flat finish, you need something harder. Tempered steel will do it. Tungsten carbide will do it. Diamond will do it. The Tiwanaku had none of these things. They were a Bronze Age culture, working with copper and stone hammers, materials that would deform and shatter against diorite long before they shaped it. The math does not work. The metallurgy does not work. The supposed builders did not possess the harder tools that the work itself demands. This is the part archaeologists tend to walk past quickly. The dates are confident. The attribution is confident. The methodology is a shrug. The blocks at Puma Punku sit there in the cold mountain light, indifferent to the timeline assigned to them, bearing the marks of a precision their official builders had no way to achieve. Either the timeline is wrong, or the toolkit is wrong, or something happened on that plateau that has been quietly written out of the record. And once you accept that a site this anomalous can be explained away with a shrug, you start to wonder what happens when the anomaly is too large to walk past at all. What happens when someone insists they have found something that everyone else insists cannot be real? Number 6. The Bosnian Pyramids. In 2005, a Bosnian-American businessman named Semir Osmanagic walked into a valley near the town of Visoko and announced that the forested hill rising above it was not a hill at all. It was a pyramid. He called it the Pyramid of the Sun. He claimed it stood 720 feet tall, which would make it taller than the Great Pyramid of Giza. He claimed it was the oldest, largest pyramid on Earth. The hill in question is called Visochika. Seen from the valley floor, it does something a hill is not supposed to do. It tapers. Its 4 slopes meet at angles that look measured. From certain approaches, it presents an almost perfect triangle, green with forest, rising out of central Bosnia like a shape that wandered in from another continent. Tourists photograph it. Locals point at it. The eye keeps insisting on geometry, where geology says there should be none. Osmanagic began excavating. His teams reported tunnels running beneath the structure. Inside those tunnels, they said they found ceramic blocks, large flat objects that looked manufactured rather than natural. They reported electromagnetic readings emanating from the hill, a steady signal measured at 28 kilohertz, broadcasting from inside the stone for reasons no one could explain. Visitors described standing in the tunnels and feeling the air change, a pressure on the skin, a low pull at the base of the skull. Then the scientific establishment responded. The European Association of Archaeologists, one of the most credentialed bodies on the continent, issued a public statement. They called the Bosnian pyramids a hoax, a cruel hoax, a fabrication that threatened genuine archaeological heritage in the region. They warned that real Neolithic and medieval sites were being damaged by the excavation. They named Osmanagic. They named the project. They said the hill was a hill. The case, as far as mainstream archaeology was concerned, was closed. And here is where the story turned strange. Because nothing stopped. The excavations continued. The tunnels grew longer. The tourism industry around Visoko expanded. Buses arrive. Tickets are sold. Independent researchers fly in to take their own readings, to photograph the ceramic blocks, to walk the tapering slopes. A foundation operates. A website publishes findings. Conferences are held. The 28 kilohertz signal, according to those who measure it, has not gone away. You are now standing inside a question the Codex of Modern Archaeology was not built to answer. Two institutions exist in the same valley. One holds peer review, credentials, and the consensus of every major academic body in Europe. The other holds shovels, visitors, ceramic fragments, and a hill that insists on its own geometry. Both call themselves the truth. Only one of them is allowed to publish in journals. The Bosnian pyramids may be exactly what the European Association of Archaeologists says they are. A misread landform, a businessman's fantasy dressed in the language of science. Or they may be something the credentialed world is institutionally incapable of seeing because admitting it would unmake the timeline. You cannot know from where you are sitting. You can only notice that the question itself, the question of who decides what counts as real, has stopped being academic. It has tunnels now. It has visitors. It has a signal. And it raises a larger possibility that somewhere on Earth, hidden in plain geography, a lost civilization might be waiting to be recognized. Number 5. Sahara Atlantis. Around 360 BCE, the philosopher Plato described a civilization called Atlantis, a vast power organized into concentric rings of land and water, destroyed in a single day and night. For more than 2,000 years, scholars filed the story under myth, a morality tale, a literary device, something the old Greek invented to make a point about hubris. Then, satellites started photographing the Sahara. In the deserts of Mauritania, near the edge of a region geologists call the Adrar Plateau, sits a structure called the Eye of the Sahara. It is also known as the Richat structure. From orbit, it looks like a bullseye of cream, ochre, and rust-red rock, concentric rings carved into the desert floor, roughly 30 miles wide. 3 nested circles. Geometry so precise it stops you mid-scroll the first time you see it. Geologists insist it is an eroded dome, a geological accident. Layers of rock pushed upward and then sanded down by wind and time into a coincidence of circles. That is the official answer. That is the answer you are allowed to publish. Here is where the explanation starts to fracture. The Richat structure sits at the edge of what was once a lush, river-fed region during what climatologists call the African humid period. 10,000 years ago, this was not desert. It was grassland and lakes and flowing water. The Sahara was green. Animals migrated through it. Humans lived in it. The land Plato described, fertile, ringed by water, sustained by rivers from the surrounding highlands, fits the prehistoric Sahara with a precision that should not be possible from a Greek writing in the 4th century BCE. The diameter matches. The rings match. The destruction by water matches, because when the African humid period ended, the climate collapsed. Not slowly. In some regions, in geological terms, almost overnight. The lakes vanished. The rivers died. Whatever lived there had to leave or be buried. A single day and night. Plato said the survivors of Atlantis carried the story across the sea, where it passed through Egyptian priests before reaching Greek ears. The Egyptian priests, in his telling, told Solon that the Greeks were children, that they had forgotten the older world, that there had been civilizations before theirs, civilizations the sand had taken. This is the part the Academy cannot say out loud, not because the evidence is absent, but because admitting it requires conceding that an oral tradition survived 9,000 years of human migration with its geography intact. That a story dismissed as fable might be a memory. That the ringed city in the desert might not be a metaphor. It might be a place you can fly over right now. You can pull up satellite imagery tonight. You can look at it yourself. 3 concentric rings of cream and ochre and rust sitting in the dead center of a region that was once green, ringed by water, abandoned in a climatic collapse so abrupt it qualifies, by any reasonable definition, as a day and a night. The mainstream answer is erosion. Coincidence. A trick of geology that happens to align with the oldest surviving account of a lost civilization in Western literature. Maybe it is coincidence. Maybe Plato was guessing. Maybe the rings are an accident of stone. Or maybe the story was always true, and we have been standing on the wrong continent looking for it. Maybe the desert remembers what the textbooks will not. And maybe the priests who told Solon the Greeks were children were not speaking in metaphor at all. Number 4, the Sumerian Anunnaki theory. In roughly 3,500 BCE, in the floodplains between the Tigris and Euphrates, scribes pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay and recorded the oldest written stories on Earth. Among those stories is a name, the Anunnaki, gods who descended from the sky. The tablets describe them as rulers, makers, judges. They came down. They shaped humanity. They walked among the first cities. To Sumerologists, this is mythology. The standard cosmology of a Bronze Age people trying to explain a world they didn't understand. To a small group of fringe researchers, it is something else. It is a memory. In the 1970s, a writer named Zecharia Sitchin published a series of books arguing that the Sumerians were not inventing gods. They were reporting visitors. Sitchin claimed the Anunnaki came from a planet he called Nibiru, a world on a long elliptical orbit beyond the outer solar system. He claimed they had come for one resource: gold, not as currency, as atmospheric repair, a shield for a dying homeworld. And he claimed that when they needed labor to dig it out of the African earth, they engineered a species to do the work. Us. Modern scholars universally reject Sitchin's translations. Every accredited Sumerologist who has examined his work has found it linguistically baseless, a chain of mistranslations stacked into a cosmology. The academic verdict is closed. The case is settled. And yet the imagery on the tablets remains. Carved into cylinder seals and stone reliefs, the Anunnaki are shown standing beside winged discs hovering in the air above them. They hold objects in their hands that look, to modern eyes, like handbags. Rectangular, rigid, with a clear handle gripped between the fingers. The same shape appears in Göbekli Tepe carvings, thousands of years older. The same shape appears in Mesoamerica. The same shape appears across cultures that never touched. On the wrists of some figures, there are bands with circular faces, raised, detailed, what some interpret as wristwatches. Mainstream archaeology calls them bracelets and ceremonial cuffs. The tablets do not explain. Then there is the Sumerian King List, a document that records the rulers of Mesopotamia in unbroken succession. The later kings reign for normal human lifespans, decades, sometimes a little more. But the earliest kings, the ones who ruled before the flood, reign for tens of thousands of years each. Alulim, 28,800 years. Alalangar, 36,000. The numbers climb into figures that no human body could survive. And then the list says the flood swept over the land, and kingship was lowered again from heaven, and the reigns shrink to human scale. Scholars read this as symbolic, a numerical convention, a literary device to mark the mythic age from the historical one. Sitchin read it as a record. Pre-flood rulers were not human. Post-flood rulers were. This is the part that the Academy will not engage with on its own terms. Not because the evidence is overwhelming. It isn't. but because the question itself is radioactive. Any tenured scholar who treats the Anunnaki as anything but mythology ends their career. The translations are forbidden, not by edict, but by professional gravity. So the tablets sit in museum cases in London and Berlin and Baghdad, and the winged discs hover above the carved figures, and the handbags hang at their sides. And no one in a university is allowed to ask what the scribes thought they were drawing. You are looking at a record. You are not allowed to read it as one. Number 3, the Great Pyramid as an energy device. The Great Pyramid of Giza is built from roughly 2.3 million limestone and granite blocks. Some of those blocks weigh 80 tons. They were quarried, dressed, and lifted into place with a precision that modern construction firms admit they could not replicate at that scale today. The official explanation is that this colossal machine of stone was a tomb, a burial chamber for a single king. Yet in over 4,000 years of investigation, no mummy has ever been found inside the Great Pyramid. No body, no funerary goods, no painted inscriptions on the chamber walls. The largest, most precisely engineered structure of the ancient world contains no evidence of the function we have assigned it. That absence has driven a different kind of investigator toward a different kind of theory. The king's chamber sits on a foundation of massive granite beams. Granite is piezoelectric, meaning it generates voltage under pressure. Squeeze it, vibrate it, load it with weight, and electrons move. The chamber is therefore not just resting on stone. It is resting on a material that, under the right mechanical stress, produces electricity. Above the king's chamber sit 5 additional layers of granite blocks, each separated by space, each contributing more pressure to the piezoelectric foundation below. Engineers call this overkill for structural support. Theorists call it a stack. Nikola Tesla speculated that the geometry of the pyramid itself could focus electromagnetic energy, drawing it from the surrounding atmosphere and concentrating it within the chamber. He believed shape was not decorative. Shape was function. A pyramid with the exact angles, the exact orientation to magnetic north, the exact proportions of the Giza monument was, in his mind, an antenna carved from rock. Walk inside, and the architecture stops feeling ceremonial. The Queen's chamber produces a strange, muffled acoustic dampening, as if the limestone is swallowing sound before it can return to your ears. Stand in the Grand Gallery, and the geometry resonates at low frequencies, a core-belled tunnel of stone that hums with vibrations too deep to identify. The chambers are not sized for human comfort. They are sized for waveforms. The shafts that pierce the structure do not lead to burial niches. They lead outward, angled at celestial coordinates, narrow conduits running through millions of tons of rock for reasons no Egyptologist has fully explained. You have been told this is a coffin. The evidence inside it suggests a circuit. Consider what that would mean. A structure designed not to house the dead, but to generate, focus, or transmit energy. A machine of stone built by a civilization we credit with copper chisels and rope. Either they had access to engineering principles we have only recently rediscovered, or they had access to something older. Knowledge inherited. Blueprints handed down from a source we have not identified and cannot date. The mainstream answer is that the absence of a mummy proves only that the chamber was robbed. The harder question is why a tomb robber would steal a body and leave the granite sarcophagus, too large to have been brought in through the existing passages, sitting empty in its chamber for 4,000 years. The Great Pyramid does not behave like a tomb. It behaves like infrastructure. And infrastructure implies purpose. Purpose implies designers who understood materials science, acoustic engineering, and electromagnetic theory at a level our timeline says was impossible for them to possess. Every measurement taken inside that structure pushes the date of advanced human knowledge backward. Every silent chamber pushes it further still. And once you accept that the timeline can be pushed back at Giza, you are forced to ask how far back it actually goes. Number 2. Göbekli Tepe. In southeastern Turkey, on a windswept ridge overlooking the Mesopotamian plain, sits a site that should not exist. Göbekli Tepe is dated to 9600 BCE. That number is worth holding in your mind for a moment. It predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It predates the pyramids of Giza by 7,000 years. When the first stones of Göbekli Tepe were raised, the last mammoths were still alive. Agriculture had not been invented. Writing was unimaginable. Pottery did not exist anywhere on Earth. And yet, someone built this. The site consists of massive T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in circles, ringed like stone congregations around a central pair of monoliths. The pillars stand 18 feet tall. Some weigh up to 20 tons. They were quarried, shaped, transported, and erected with a precision that demanded coordinated labor, engineering knowledge, and a shared symbolic vocabulary. Carved into their faces, in low relief, are foxes, scorpions, and vultures, predators and scavengers, creatures of death and warning. The animals stare outward from the stone with an intensity that doesn't feel decorative. It feels theological. According to mainstream archaeology, this site was officially built by nomadic hunter-gatherers, people who followed herds, people who slept in temporary shelters, people who had no pottery, no metal, no writing, no agriculture, no domesticated animals, no urban centers, no recorded religion. By every framework we use to define a civilization, the builders of Göbekli Tepe were not one, but they raised 20-ton stones in coordinated circles 11,000 years ago. Here's where the timeline begins to collapse. For over a century, the standard story of human civilization ran in one direction. First, humans learned to farm. Farming produced surplus food. Surplus food produced settled villages. Settled villages produced specialized labor. Specialized labor produced priests, temples, and religion. Agriculture was the seed. Everything else grew from it. This sequence was treated as natural law. It was taught in every textbook, in every classroom, in every documentary about the origins of human society. Göbekli Tepe reverses the arrow. The temple came first. The gathering came first. The shared belief came first. Some researchers now argue that the desire to build something like Göbekli Tepe is what drove humans to invent agriculture in the first place. You cannot feed a 1,000-strong workforce on wild gazelle and foraged grain. To raise these pillars, the builders may have been forced to domesticate the land around them. The temple created the farm, not the other way around. Religion may have built civilization, not the reverse. This is not a minor correction. This is the entire human origin story turned inside out, and then comes the strangest detail of all. Around 8000 BCE, the builders returned to Göbekli Tepe and deliberately buried it. They filled the circles with sand and rubble, by hand, layer by layer, until the pillars vanished beneath an artificial hill. They did not destroy it. They did not abandon it. They entombed it with care, the way you would seal a thing that was no longer safe to leave exposed. We do not know why. We do not know what they were burying it against. The stones lay hidden under the soil for 10,000 years, silent, preserved, waiting. When archaeologists finally uncovered the first pillars in the 1990s, they assumed they were medieval. The dating came back, and the discipline went quiet. Because if Göbekli Tepe is real, and the dates are right, then everything we were told about who we were 12,000 years ago is wrong. There were people on this planet capable of monumental architecture before they were supposed to know how to grow wheat. Someone taught them, or someone older remembered. Which raises a question the discipline does not want to ask out loud. What came before the hunter-gatherers? What were they trying to preserve when they buried it? And what exactly happened to the world just a few thousand years earlier that might have made a culture decide that some kinds of knowledge had to be saved underground? Number 1. The Younger Dryas impact and the civilization we forgot. Roughly 12,800 years ago, something hit the Earth. The climate, which had been slowly warming out of the last ice age, reversed in a geological instant. Temperatures plunged across the northern hemisphere. Megafauna across multiple continents went extinct in a window so narrow it barely registers in the rock record. Mammoths, dire wolves, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, all gone. This sudden reversal is called the Younger Dryas, and mainstream science has spent decades arguing about what caused it. Researchers Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock have proposed something the Academy refuses to seriously entertain. A comet, or a swarm of comet fragments, struck the North American ice sheet. The impact vaporized billions of tons of ice, triggered continent-scale flooding, and erased an advanced precursor civilization that had been quietly developing through the warm millennia before. The survivors, scattered and traumatized, became the hunter-gatherers we find in the archaeological record. The knowledge died with the cities. The physical evidence is harder to dismiss than the theory. Across North America, geologists have identified a thin, dark stratum called the black mat, a layer that sits exactly at the Younger Dryas boundary. Inside it, researchers have found nanodiamonds, microspherules, and platinum spikes, the chemical fingerprints of a high-energy impact event. Above the black mat, the megafauna are gone. Below it, they are everywhere. The line between worlds is a few centimeters of soot. Then there are the scablands of eastern Washington, vast tracts of land stripped down to bedrock, gouged by channels called coulees that run up to 900 feet deep. These weren't carved by rivers. They were carved by walls of water moving at impossible speeds, floods so violent that geologists initially refused to believe in them. The landscape itself records a catastrophe at a scale modern humans have never witnessed. Boulders the size of houses, carried hundreds of miles. Ripple marks in the earth tall enough to hide a building. Whatever happened there happened fast, and it happened to a world that already had people in it. Here is where the theory turns its blade inward. Our entire origin story, the one taught in every textbook, begins around 10,000 BCE with the first agricultural settlements. We tell ourselves this is the beginning, the dawn of civilization, the moment our species finally figured out how to grow food, build walls, organize labor. But the Younger Dryas impact happened just before that. The black mat sits directly beneath the foundations of human history. And if Carlson and Hancock are right, agriculture isn't an origin at all. It's a restart. The survivors of something we cannot remember, teaching their grandchildren how to plant seeds because the old ways were gone. You are not the descendant of the first civilization. You are the descendant of the second one. The first ended in fire and flood and a sky that turned to ash, and everyone who knew how to read its books drowned in the meltwater. What you call history is the small, bright fragment that came after. 12,000 years of rebuilding on top of a grave we never knew was there. And the comet swarm that did it is still out there. The orbit that intersected ours has not closed. The cycle that ended the last world is a cycle, which means it has a next time. You are living in the interval between two impacts, and you have no idea how much of it is left. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.